Hi, Michael.
Hi, Naftali. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Great to see you. And thank you. You're actually going to be the first person I interview for our new Facebook page, Wine and Torah. So
I'm honored.
I hope it's an honor. I don't know yet. Depends on who comes after you, right?
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah. So that's definitely, if you hear any funny noises, that's tinfoil because it's Pesach is approaching.
Uh-huh. I understand.
Yeah, exactly. So I know I've personally met you through being in Northern California, seeing you at various Shabbos settings. We can talk about that later. Um, you have a kind of a very interesting story to tell about how you got into the wine business, because we're really here to talk about wine, talk about your wine, talk about Torah, talk about your Torah, your personal experiences. So tell us a little background about, how did you get into making wine, making kosher wine?
Well, most of my life, I didn't really have an interest in wine in any particular way other than having some at Kiddush Friday night or Shabbos day. And in 2008, when the economy crashed, I had been working as a book editor, and most of my work dried up at the time. And I was talking with a rabbi in my Berkeley community about my situation, and he offered to sort of reduce my stress by giving me some work doing hashgacha, which I had never done before. But he said, "Look, I'll show you what to do. It's not that hard, etc." So I began doing, a bat mitzvah, a wedding, a this or that, and one day he calls me up and he says, "Look, I've just gotten a call from the Orthodox Union, and they need somebody to supervise a champagne production up north, about 2 hours north of the Bay Area, and they requested you." And I was a bit shocked because I said to him, "Look, I've never worked for the OU, and I've never worked in champagne, or I don't really know what to do." And he said, "Look, they've asked for you, they want you, they'll pay you." I said, "Okay, fine, I'll go." So the next day, I drove about 2 hours north to this place in a place called Hopland. And there was this huge staff all prepared to do the champagne production, and with all the equipment and everything. And I show up and they say, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Michael. I was told that you wanted me." And they said, "Well, you're not the Michael we wanted." So they made a few phone calls, and they realized that the Michael that they'd wanted had moved away 3 years before, but now they had everything set up and it had to be made that day. And so they said, "Okay, so we'll teach you." So, I said, "Okay, fine, I'm getting paid to learn." So the interesting thing about a champagne production is, champagne's a little bit different than wine, that most people think of it because
Can you tell us a little bit about how champagne is different than wine?
Sure. Well, I think most people know that champagne has lots of little bubbles in it. It's effervescent. And the way that is typically achieved is you make the wine, it goes through the whole fermentation. It becomes dry and it would taste just like a normal wine. Let's say it's a Chardonnay. It would taste like a dry Chardonnay. Then what they do is they create a special sauce, so to speak, where they take a bunch, they take some of the wine and they add a lot of sugar into it. Then they add yeast into that. That slurry gets mixed back into the champagne, and the sugar provides the food for the yeast, and the yeast begin a secondary fermentation inside the bottle. But since it's a champagne bottle and it's corked in such a way that it can withstand the buildup of the pressure, unlike a regular wine bottle, it keeps all that fermentation that's going on inside the bottle. And it's not until you pop it off that it all sort of comes out. And so that's essentially what we were doing that day. And there's a
You
few
were
other
putting
things.
the slur into the Chardonnay, so to speak.
Exactly. So first, what you do is you take all the Chardonnay, you you put it through, you turn it upside down, and it gets placed in some very cold liquid called glycol that freezes the head of the champagne bottle to get rid of. So you can open it and you can get rid of whatever old yeast might have been in there. Then you pour all of that into a tank, all the bottles into a tank. Then you add the slurry, you mix it around, then you put it all back into the bottles, and then
So
you
this is
let it
very,
ferment
very,
for a certain
this is
period
very
of time. What?
bottle intensive.
It's very intensive. And if you're into kalim, wine making is your thing.
It's so interesting because that's what we're doing now. We're getting ready for Passover. Most people will watch this after Passover and they'll be like, what's going on? But that's one of the things we do, is this idea of, koshering a vessel, which most of us avoid by having a whole set of Pesach pots and pans. But I guess, so this is like
in
a real life
hashgacha,
thing.
what?
It's like a scientific kind of cleaning the bottle to get rid of the old yeast so that it could,
Correct. And when one's doing, a special wine production at a facility that doesn't normally do kosher wine production, then the mashgiach has to kosher all of the tanks, kosher the lines, kosher anything that is going to be coming into contact with the wine or the champagne, so that it retains its kosher LePesach status. Because in the kosher world, making wine or champagne that's not kosher LePesach is about the dumbest business move you could make, because Pesach is the time when most people are buying their wine. So it always needs to be kosher LePesach. And once that's done, then you can do whatever other processes are involved in terms of making the wine.
So what's interesting in a sense of what you're doing when you kosher the tanks to make a kosher run, if it's in a non-kosher facility, is you're koshering it so that it should be, kosher from the previous non-kosher wine. And coincidentally, it's also going to be kosher for Pesach, because koshering is koshering. Once you kosher it, it also gets rid of any, not that there would be a likelihood that there would be chametz in a run, unless maybe I'm not thinking of something, because I don't really know when.
Very unlikely that there would be mamish chametz. I suppose if the yeast came in touch with a floating kernel of wheat that happened to be in the air, maybe.
Yeah, unlikely. But okay. But it's an added bonus.
It's a chumrah. You do it and you make sure.
You're doing it anyway for what you need it to be done. Okay.
Yeah.
So you get there, they set you up, they teach you how to make. You basically to be able to make kosher wine, they need somebody who's shomer Shabbos to basically do certain steps in the wine making process.
Correct.
So you don't. So on the one hand, you're not a winemaker because you just got there. It's your first day on the job. They didn't even you. It was a mistake, or maybe it was divine providence. Well, but so you're learning to be the mashgiach for a champagne run, and how to make champagne at the same time. Correct?
Right. I mean, they're not going into all the theories as to why they take each step, but since the mashgiach is the only person who can actually touch the product, I'm doing everything. So I'm learning as I go along.
So you're going through the motions. You're not clear exactly what it is that's happening because of what you're doing, but you're doing it. Okay.
Correct.
So why don't you then so that happened, and then
And so then
why wasn't that just a one-day job?
Well, for some reason they liked me, and they needed somebody who would be their mashgiach for the fall harvest. And this was at Hagafen Winery in Napa. And the person who had been there previously was overseas in Israel for the year. And so they asked me if I would like the position. And so I said, oh, let's try it out. I'm still at that time thinking like, I'm going to get back to my editing once the economy picks back up. And so I started working at Hagafen, and it was a great experience. Some days were very intense because, with wine, when the grapes are ripe, you have to work with them that day, and because we're making kosher wine, we've got all these other things going on like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot and Simchas Torah and Shabbos. All of these days where we can't do any wine work typically fall during the middle and or the high point of the grape harvest. So on the days when you can actually work, you're trying to do everything so that you can get things moving. And in some ways, it really keeps you linked to the festival cycle, because Sukkot, you're going to be doing winemaking, and then hopefully at Pesach you're going to be doing wine releasing, so that people have wine to drink.
Let's talk about Sukkot. I know Sukkot in California is the grape harvest season. I know from people in the wine, who've got actual vineyards who do their own estate bottle wine, that they always tell me, I'm really busy around the high holidays and particularly around Sukkot.
Yes.
Is our weather almost the same as Israel when it comes to, like, is that just a coincidence?
Yes, I mean,
how does that work out?
Subsequently to all of this, I ended up doing an internship at the Shiloh winery in Israel.
I love Shiloh. By the way, I love Hagafen as well. Hagafen is a fantastic wine. Their whites are some of the best whites. Their reds as well, and it's also in Napa, maybe the only kosher winery that's like the actual winery itself is in Napa that you can actually go to and have a tasting at.
Yes, exactly. It's a wonderful place to visit, and I highly recommend people to do that. And
definitely worth it. If you're there, you got to go. And then Shiloh, fantastic winery as well. And you interned in Shiloh. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I interned in Shiloh, and the reason I had mentioned is because it was at the same cycle of all the chagim and everything, and you're just trying to squeeze it. A lot of winemakers, mostly Yom Kippur, they're at the winery, working all night long because things are happening. Wine's a living process. The yeast and the grapes don't just get put on hold. They're evolving. So, but my time in Shiloh working with Amichai Lurie was an incredible experience. One of the hardest working people I've ever met in my life. Driving all around the country to go to different vineyards to source the grapes, to put them in the fermentation tanks, etc. And it's also got that specialness that you're in Eretz Yisrael, you're in Eretz HaKodesh, and it adds something to the experience. So if a person were to go to Sefaria.org and to look and type in the word wine to see how often it appears in Jewish texts, it's something like 2,500 times that wine is mentioned in Tanakh and in the liturgy and in the Talmud, etc. It's such an essential part of Jewish life. I think it really actually maybe distinguishes us from other cultures in how primary wine is. I mean, even at a bris, the 8-day-old baby's getting a little taste of wine.
He is. I can tell you that they're plying them with liquor from an early age.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it is wine. The reason why we have this this Facebook page, Wine and Torah, is because of what you just said. How many times wine shows up? It's much more than people can imagine. And whether it's about being blessed with good wine, like the patriarchs blessing their children, some of the tribes with the wine that mentioning wine specifically, whether it's the festivals where it mentions wine, whether it's the idea of rejoicing on a festival with wine, or making kiddush or havdalah, or a Birchat Hamazon of the 4 cups of wine, or the Birchat Kiddushin, the blessings that we make under the chuppah, or the Sheva brachas that we continuously make during the week of the wedding. I mean, again, all of these things and so much, much more. That's just like the tip of the iceberg. So, for example, there's a statement in the Talmud, Ein omrim shir ela al yayin, that we don't sing a song. It doesn't mean people. It means in the temple. They wouldn't sing a song except when they were doing wine libations on the altar. There's actually only one exception, basically, which is they would sing Hallel when they were offering the Karban Pesach, the Paschal offering. They weren't pouring wine at that time when they were making the offering, yet they still sang. So that's just like a little bit. And I wanted people to be able to write about it, talk about it, discuss it, and we're hoping to continue to do that. But I'm so happy that you actually connected with me, because I want people to not just have this be an academic or even Torah approach to wine, but it should be connected to people who are not just drinking and enjoying wine, but also to people who are, their livelihood is wine, and their passion is wine, which is why we're talking. And in a weird way, for people who can't even drink wine, let's say I'm not suggesting that they join the group, but if, sometimes maybe if you understand that there's an idea of wine, it doesn't have to be actually wine,
Mm-hmm.
the bechina, like we don't bring a Pesach offering, but we still have the idea of what the Pesach offering represents. So
Yes.
perhaps I'll talk about that with some people in AA later, if there's any place for a discussion about the meaning of wine without actual wine, which in my opinion there may be. But let's get back to your story. So you end up getting involved kind of through an accident, like literally an accident, do you think of that as an accident? How do you see
No,
this?
I mean, I really think it's some kind of, Hashem and the universe wanting me there and to get involved in this, because it wasn't just, that incident, but that kind of experience in my relationship to wine seemed to follow me over and over again. I worked at Hagafen for a number of years. Started making some wine myself, nothing that I was particularly proud of. And then I started working at another winery called Gallo in Fresno.
That's
and it's the biggest winery in the world. They don't make kosher wine yet, although I hear that they've got some plans, but they make kosher food coloring from grapes, which required hashgacha.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened was I was doing this job and I got a call from my father's Harusa, who's a Chabad Shaliach up in now in Walnut Creek, but was in Brentwood, California, who had a congregant who had just purchased a vineyard, who had told him, look, we've got some, grapes. If you want to make some wine for the community, great. So he contacted me, having heard from my dad that I make wine, and said, look, would you come help me make wine? I said, look, I'm 3 hours south from you. It's going to be difficult, blah, blah, blah. And he said, look, come on. So I said, okay, fine, I'll do this. So we went up there, went to the vineyard. The grapes we were given were Zinfandel. And while I was in the vineyard, I tasted some of their other grapes. One of them was the Malvasia grape, which was exquisite. We made the Zinfandel. It was terrible. So bad, we just had to pour it in the streets of Oakland. And I remember little kids jumping over this little river of wine going down the street. And, but I said to my partner who, I'd worked with, I said, look, why don't we try making some of that Malvasia wine next year? So he said, okay, I'll ask them. So we got a hold of some, we made it. And then I decided to submit it to the California State Fair, because I had been told they will give anybody who submits wine feedback on their wine, how to make it better, what they like, what they don't. So I thought, great. So I submitted it. And then to my great surprise, we won the double gold. And
that's amazing.
It was amazing. It was completely amazing. So I got feedback much better than I had anticipated receiving. And at that point, my partner and I sort of looked at each other and said, maybe we have something here. So over the next 3 or 4 years, we made a little bit more each year, tried a few different varietals, and learned some things, made mistakes along the way, and figured out what the kinks were that we needed to iron out so that we could actually eventually go commercial. And this spring, hopefully by Shavuot, we'll be doing our first big commercial release. We've done small ones, but because of COVID, because of the fires that had happened last year with the smoke and everything in California, and then with the war in the Ukraine, which has interfered with a lot of the bottle supplies, we've had to delay our release. So, for example, our bottle supply company gets their bottles from the Ukraine. So there was just no bottles. You couldn't get any bottles from the Ukraine. So we had to find a new company. Other companies get their stuff from China. China has delays because of COVID and lockdowns and et cetera. So finally we found somebody, and we're hoping we'll have something by Shavuot. So that's where things are currently.
Wow.
Yes.
That's great.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about the community. You're living in Berkeley, correct?
Yes.
How is that? I remember we had Shabbos dinner with you, and there was Marat Victoria and her husband, who he is a fantastic baker.
Yes, amazing bread maker, Adam Brillo, ground bread,
Adam's
amazing.
bread is. I told them they gotta sell that. It's like I've had some good bread. We got some good bread here in New York, but nothing like that.
And it's amazing.
And my daughter said, I said, how was Shabbos dinner? She goes, it seems like everyone there makes something.
Yes, it's true. It's a very maker, do-it-yourself community. If you're not fermenting something or making sourdough or yogurt or wine or pickles, or you're not doing something weird with the salmon, smoked salmon made with marijuana smoke, whatever it is, everybody in Berkeley makes something. And
I think it's Berkeley is more Brooklyn than Brooklyn. It's in terms of like the hipster, do-it-yourself, crunchy granola. I mean, I guess Brooklyn is catching up to Berkeley, is what you can say. But it's fantastic. And I personally, just to tell the truth, I'm from Berkeley. I grew up there. I lived there, from 1972 as an infant through 1980, and it never left me. Kind of that vibe. I'd go back many summers to be there, including the time like we last connected. So yeah, that was great. Does that have something to do with kind of that creative spirit? Did that have something to do with your, the divine providence leading you in this way?
Yes. Well, I often say that if I had been living in LA when I got the call to be a mashgiach, I might have become a film director, because maybe I would have gotten called to do hashgacha for a movie set, and they would have said, look, we're going to need somebody during the fall, and I'd be working with Spielberg or something. But since I was in the Bay Area and the wine region is up there, I became a winemaker. And one of the things that I think is fascinating about wine is that we utilize it to create sacred time or sacred moments. We use Kiddush to sanctify Shabbos or the Yom Tov. It's sort of like the way that we demarcate that we're no longer in regular time, we're in holy time. And wine itself is a transformed product, right? And so is bread. You have this invisible stuff that's in the air, yeast, that transforms the grapes and the juice into wine. And so then when we take this transformed product, it itself is transformative, and it transforms us. We get a little happy, a little shikker. We change, the time changes, and it's incredible that our tradition really has a structure for using it. I mean, granted, on Purim, the structure is completely blown out of the water, but most of the time, what's interesting about Purim and Pesach is they're adjacent to each other. But Purim, you blow everything out, but you're not required to drink a certain number of cups. Whereas Pesach, you're required to drink 4 cups of wine, but it's not typically a holiday that people get drunk on. Somehow it's paced out. Maybe it's because the meal is 6 hours long, or 12 if you're in Berkeley,
I mean, that's a whole nother conversation of how to drink wine, what wines to drink at the Seder, because you've got, on the one hand, the biggest kind of Jewish consumer interest around kosher wine is definitely leading up to Passover, because even less observant people will still participate in the Seder. So they'll get a bottle of wine, maybe they'll get a case. If they're having guests, maybe they'll get 2, maybe they'll get all the kosher wine for the year. On the other hand, you and I know that it's hard to take 4 cups of wine. It shouldn't necessarily be a 12-ounce cup, and just knock it back 4 times. Well,
Right.
I tell people, like if somebody's a diabetic, right, they could take just over an ounce of grape juice. They could add another 2.5 ounces just to make it a total of water or seltzer. And so that would be 4 times. So 4 cups would total a little bit over 4 ounces of grape juice. That's if they drank the whole cup. If they wanted to, they could drink half the cup. So it would be, I'm not a doctor, I don't know what a diabetic, how much grape juice they could have. It would add up to 2 ounces of grape juice. But the point is, you could go from anywhere from somebody having a 12-ounce glass. Some people have 24-ounce glasses. You don't have to have the whole glass, but it's preferred. So you could have a 12-ounce, 14% alcohol. That's a whole bottle of wine. That's 2 bottles of wine, maybe more. I don't know the math. I know a regular glass of wine is 4 in a bottle, right? So
Yes,
that's
typically.
two bottles of wine. So you're going to get very drunk. You're going to have a hangover, or you could have, or you have, between 2 and 5 ounces of grape juice mixed in with seltzer. If you're diabetic, whatever it is you need to do. So there's something. The point is, there's something there for everyone, But
yeah, I mean, what I typically do is that I start off with red, because there's I think a minhag
preferential for red,
right? And then I slowly move over to less intense, and eventually I just have like a semi-sweet white. Which is going to typically have lower alcohol. So let's say if my red that I'm starting with is 14%, and the white I end up with is at like 7.5 or 8%. It's just easier to manage this, especially as the night goes on.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'll start with kind of a real wine, a real red. By the 4th cup, you don't really need a fancy wine, because it's just like kind of like, it's a little heavy, whatever it is.
Right.
So I'd say 1, maybe 2, half decent wine. Then you switch it over to something low alcohol with some bubbles.
Yes, exactly.
Pink champagne. What do you call pink champagne? What is the name for that?
Moscato.
Moscato. There you go.
Yes.
There you go. That's
so for example, so like I have my red, that this is a little self-promotion, but I have my red that I would start with. It's a Petit Verdot Petit Syrah blend. It's about 13% alcohol. And then I would move to my semi-sweet, which it's a white wine.
What's that called? The focus is a little bit off.
This is Muscat Canelli.
Oh, okay,
but
great.
It's let me see something. Well, I can hold on a second.
It came into focus towards the end of when you held it up.
And then I might do either a rosé, which could be dry, or I also make a semi-sweet rosé. This is just a sample bottle I happen to have
Oh yeah, yeah.
nearby.
Rosé is definitely going to be in for the Seder. I'd say, yeah, rosé either
It's
number 2 or number 3.
right.
That
It's a
to be,
nice way. It's a nice way to integrate. It's like a balance. It's a little bit like Tu B'Shvat, where you do the blending of the wines along the way, except here you don't blend. You have the individual types. And I don't know. I think as somebody who enjoys wine, it adds a whole nother layer of pleasure to the Pesach Seder. In addition to the Seder and the food and the people and the meaning, you also have this fun thing, which is wine, and you get to try it and share it with people. I think that's the greatest thing about wine is community around it, that you could talk and somebody's going to taste apple, somebody's going to taste hay, somebody might taste chocolate, somebody might taste raspberries, somebody's going to taste wine. Whatever they're going to
yeah,
experience with
a
it.
lot of people are going to taste wine.
Yeah.
I got a backhanded compliment, which would almost be an insult. I think it was a Gabe Weiss told me. He said, you should do wine tasting and talk about wines because you have like a simple palate. The people who are talking about wine, what they're tasting, nobody can relate to. Nobody knows what the hell they're
Right.
talking about.
Exactly.
I'm like, yeah,
Exactly.
I think there's a hint of if it's a hint of lemon in here. If it's a red, it's got a lot of oak flavor.
Right.
I got 2 or 3 things to say about every wine, but that's about it. My tasting notes are very, very short. But I still can really tell what I consider to be a good wine. I can tell the difference.
Yes. No, I think my experience is the best way to actually taste how a particular wine tastes is to drink it with other wines so that you can compare.
Sure.
If you have 2 different Cabernets, for example, 2 different Cabernet Sauvignon, it's the same grape, exact same grape, but they're going to taste very different. And it could be where it's from, it could be how it's made, but it helps you to understand better. Oh, this wine is more, I don't know, let's say dry, or this tastes more oaky or more rich, or it's lighter on the palate or whatever. Then it's easier to discern those things. When you're just drinking a glass of wine by itself, it's more difficult.
Yeah. That's definitely. I mean, and it's hard to find that the problem in the kosher wine world is it's very big and it's
Yeah.
very small. Meaning there's probably what 1,000 wines now. I have no idea who's counting. I don't know. Do you have any idea how many kosher wines there are?
That I don't know. I mean, there's probably at least, I don't know, 50 to 100 kosher wineries, and each of them producing the various wines they make. So
Yeah, and yet I'm still going back to the same kind of 20 wines or so. It's not that I can't broaden it a little bit, but at the same and like there'll be a brand where I'll like a particular year, but if I don't like the next year, I'm just gonna not go back to that wine because why spend the $20 or the $30 on something that I have to remember each time I go to, I only like the 2018. I don't like the 19 or, things like that.
right. Yeah, I
So
think what most winemakers are hoping for is that there's some consistency year after year in their wines, so that people kind of have a sense of like, oh, if I buy such and such bottle, I know what it's going to be like. I can count on it.
You want to hope that, and it's often true. I know California, for example, has had a lot of fires, and that affects the grapes, and they're probably going to learn how to clean that up with the things like that. Is that something that's affected any of the places you've gotten your grapes from?
Well, none of the places that I've gotten my grapes from, but last year we took a break from it because the smoke was so bad.
Because of the smoke.
But I do know winemakers who have purchased grapes that were tainted by smoke, and you can taste it in the wine even after they've done what's called reverse osmosis, where you take out the smoke flavor molecules. It's not a perfect science yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that may become more and more sophisticated given climate change and whatever other challenges, cause these fires to occur. So
Can you tell us a little bit about how you make your wine? Let's take the red, let's take that, the one that you won that prize with. What did you do to make that?
okay. So the one that I won the prize with was a white. And so we meet with the farmer, decide we're going to purchase a certain number of tons of grapes. That's typically how it's sold, in tons. And they arrive in half-ton bins. So imagine a bin that's 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet high even. And then it's just filled with grapes. Those are brought to us on a truck. We have a forklift. We lift them off the truck, and then we dump them into what's called a hopper. It's basically like a funnel that funnels the grapes into what's called a crusher. And the crusher, at least our crusher, does two things. It removes the stems, so the stems don't go into the wine, and it breaks the grapes so that they become crushed and all the juice can become released. And all of that gets pumped into a large, what's called a hydraulic basket press. It's a big press that you can imagine if you think of like a cylinder that's got a plunger on the top that slowly pushes down on the grapes so that it extracts more and more juice. So that occurs, and that takes several hours, and that juice gets pumped into a tank. Once it's in the tank, we add yeast. We add SO2, which protects against bacteria and oxygen spoilage, and the fermentation process begins. The fermentation process can take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, depending on.
Can you explain the difference to make a white versus a red in terms of the skins of the grapes?
Sure. So there's two things. One is a white wine typically is made with green grapes, and a red wine is made with red grapes. And with a red wine, when you crush the grapes, you leave the skin soaking in the juice while it ferments. And that fermentation, because of the heat, extracts all this red or purple coloring out of the grape skins, and so you get red wine. With white wine, you don't leave the skins in. You just crush it and you just extract the juice and you get rid of the skins. And so it stays, yellow, green, white, that kind of variation. A person can make white wine with red grapes if you don't add the skins in, but it's a little more complicated.
What you use white grapes, green grapes, I mean?
Yes. For our whites, we use green grapes, and for the red, I use red grapes. Or I mean, the grapes that are for the red, they actually look black. Most grapes.
And how long did you what did you do with the wine once you they were in a tank, and then what did you do?
Okay, so it's in the tank. It's going through the fermentation process, which is basically the yeast is eating the sugar that's in the grape juice and converting the sugar into two byproducts, carbon dioxide and alcohol. So the carbon dioxide is being released. If you were to open a wine tank, you'd suddenly be hit by a lot of CO2, which is not a pleasant experience, but that CO2 protects the juice while it's going through that process. Once that's done, you basically have wine, but it typically is not the same clarity of wine that one expects when you buy a bottle of wine in a store. So what happens from there is there's a series of steps called racking, where you rack the what's called the clean wine off of all the materials that have settled down to the bottom of the tank. The yeast, the little bits of skin that were left in there, whatever else may have been, little pieces of dirt that might have gotten in there, that all sinks down. And you do that several times, and each time you do that, it clarifies the wine further. Then we do two other things. We do what's called cold stabilization, where we drop the temperature of the tank down to about freezing. And what that does, or a little bit even below freezing, and what that does is it helps to drop out what's known as tartaric acid. It helps to drop out quite a bit of that, so that when the wine is ultimately bottled, you don't get these little crystals forming in the wine bottle, because even though they're not bad for you, consumers might worry, what are those things? Then we do something called heat stabilization, where you basically add clay to the wine, and the clay has these positively charged ions that draw out the proteins, because wine actually has protein. Grapes have protein in it. So it draws out the protein, and that settles to the bottom, so that if your bottle of wine happens to be sitting in a warm area, it doesn't start developing this little protein haze in there. Again, nothing
Shouldn't
that
turn
would be
into like kombucha.
like kombucha. Yeah, you can drink that stuff, but most people aren't drinking kombucha for the little stuff that's
I thought they pay
sliding
extra
around.
for that in the kombucha. Or maybe that's why they drink the kombucha, but not wine.
Right.
Yeah.
So we do that, and then we have a filtration where we filter it even more finely, so it's even more clear, and then we bottle it.
Okay. So how long till it gets into the bottle from when you crush it?
With the whites, about 5-6 months.
Uh-huh. And what about
Yeah.
the reds?
The reds, once it's gone through fermentation, we age it in barrels.
Mhm.
And that is done for a few reasons, but one of which is that because barrels are made of wood and they're slightly porous, there's a little bit of oxygen that gets in. Not enough to spoil the wine, but enough to begin to soften it. Just like when you open a bottle of wine, after maybe an hour, it usually tastes better because it's had a chance to breathe, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's what aging in barrels, that's one of the things it does. Also can impart certain flavors from the oak, depending on the type of oak or how the oak has been charred, etc. And it gives a chance for the wine to sort of like come into its own.
Mm.
It's like sort of maturing in a cocoon. And then you do the other process where you filter or not, and then bottle it.
Mhm, mhm. What do you prefer, making white because it's so much quicker, or making red because it costs more?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I love both. I love drinking both, but I prefer the making the white because I get to the finished product quickly. I mean, relatively speaking,
yeah.
in 6 months, I have a product that I can taste and enjoy. With the red, the longer you have something that you're waiting for, the more likely something could go wrong.
Mm.
So it's a little more anxiety provoking, because
Yeah,
it might be a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years before you
Oh, wow.
know what you're going to
That
have.
is a long time to wait.
I don't know how whiskey makers do it when they're waiting 12 years,
Oh, wow.
So
It's the wisdom of aging, right? It's
yes.
like the sitting in the barrel. I don't know. As we age, I don't know if that works for us or not.
Right.
Yeah. But okay, this is fascinating. Thank you for giving us a little inside peek into being a winemaker, and to being somebody who's basically listening to what God's message is for you, even if it wasn't something you planned on doing originally.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Well, thank you. Thank you
And
for
I look
taking
forward
the
to
time talking.
seeing you in person. God willing, one of these days I'll be back in Northern California. And you
We'd
get
love
to
to have you.
Binyamin every once in a while to
I'm
Binyamin
hoping to
Camp.
be out in New York in June, following the release of our white and rosé, and maybe to do even a little bit of a launch there. So
Yeah,
be
okay.
happy to be in touch with you around then.
Yeah, please, that'd be wonderful. That'd be wonderful. Yeah, we like to highlight some of the kind of these winemakers and wineries in Northern California. It's a very lovely community, lovely people like yourself that are, just I always say that in Berkeley and in Northern California in general, the people who are active in the Jewish community, it's not because there is a Jewish community that like kind of New York or even LA where you're just part of a thing. It's because they want to be there with their hearts and their spirit, and it's a very beautiful thing. So I see that in you, and that wonderful community that you're a part of. So
Thank you.
Big Yasher Koach and Mazel on your new releases coming up, and you should win more awards. And
Thank you. Thank
you should transform your work into many mitzvahs and celebrations that people around the world will participate in. It says Shagor and Bracha Shetavo, that the wine causes a blessing, meaning because we say so many blessings on wine, or because even if you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, so you use a cup of wine on it, and it transforms, like you said, just like the wine making itself is transforming through the yeast and so on. It's transforming our lives. So thank you for sharing with us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you so much, and Chag Sameach, and a kosher LePesach, and L'chaim.
Thank you. Thank you. Look forward to continuing this, and thank you for being number one to do this.
My pleasure.
Okay. Happy drinking. L'chaim.
All right. L'chaim.